All right, Carey Nieuwhof, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me, Brett.
So you got a book out called At Your Best, How to Get Time, Energy, and Priorities Working in Your Favor. And this book talks about the changes you made in your life when you experienced some pretty massive burnout in your career and in your personal life. It's about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what led up to the burnout and at what point did you realize, man, I got a problem and I got to do something about this?
One of my problems was I didn't realize I had a problem. And I think that's how a lot of people get into this spiral of burnout, whatever degree it happens to be in. Yeah. So for me, I had been in leadership for about a decade. I was leading a very fast growing not-for-profit organization, and I had a really terrible formula. And the formula was that the more growth I had, the more hours I had to work. And that doesn't scale. It just doesn't scale. I tend to be kind of a driven person, strong-willed leader, strong-willed person. And I had convinced myself that I didn't have any limits, that, other people might have to sleep more, other people may have to take time off, but I didn't really need to do it. Sort of a classic entrepreneurial mindset. And that worked for a long time. I had people warn me all through my 30s. They're like, hey, dude, if you keep working like this, you're going to burn out. And I'm like, nah, that's not going to happen. And then what was the most shocking part of that for me was, in many ways, I was at the top of my game. I had just spoken to 2,500 leaders in Atlanta at a major conference. It was like the biggest speaking event I had at that time to date in my life. We were growing really fast. And I thought, my life is fantastic. And then my body went on strike, and I woke up one day and my usual passion was gone and my thinking was not very clear. And I thought, I got to get some more sleep. So I did. And what was worse is I just kept getting worse and worse, to the point where my passion was gone, my joy was gone. I thought, wow, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the end of the road for me. And I had brain fog like I'd never had before. So that's how burnout hit me. And yeah, and I didn't recognize the signs.
I guess, was it sort of like the boiling frog? Like you didn't recognize it as it was happening?
Yeah, no, exactly. And then one day you're dead. And looking back on it, I'm like, okay, I did not declare a finish line, so my body decided to. And that seems to be a more and more common story that you hear from leaders, is like, I thought everything was okay, or I thought it was normal. Now, having lived the last 15 years a lot healthier, I can look back and say that level of fatigue is not normal. Like when you're driving in your car for 5 minutes, you feel like you need to pull over at the side of the road and have a nap. That is not normal life. When you're kind of redlining your emotions all the time, or actually, what was weird with my emotions, and this could be a clue for people to see how close they are to burnout, is I had found myself growing increasingly numb. I wasn't feeling like life is a series of highs and lows. And as much as we'd all love to avoid the lows, you're supposed to feel them. Like when somebody close to you gets sick, that is supposed to register in your heart. And conversely, when someone has some really good news, they broke some kind of sales record, or maybe they're expecting a child or something, you should feel happy for them. And I was increasingly just experiencing life as going through the motions, and I was kind of numb. And then when my emotions would surface, they would often be not related to what they should be. So if I've got two boys, if one of them was supposed to take out the trash, they didn't take out the trash, I might melt down on them. And that's a 3 out of 10 on the problem scale, but I treated it like a 12 out of 10. So there were signs at that point, but I just ignored them and blew through them because I thought, well, the rules don't apply to me. And of course, they never apply to you until they do.
So you said you were a leader of a nonprofit organization. Is this the church that you were leading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was running a church at a time. I'd originally trained as a lawyer. So I spent my 20s in university, which is a whole other story for another day, but went through the whole law thing. In the middle of law school, felt a call into ministry and ended up finishing law and then going into seminary. And I started at 3 very small, handful of people, country churches that really hadn't changed in about 30 years. And then obviously new leadership brings change. And we became the fastest growing church in our denomination in the country and one of the largest in the country in a period of about a decade. So it was that rocket ride that I was riding that just about killed me.
Well, and you make this point in the book, you were doing the thing that you wanted to do, right? You wanted
Yeah.
to, this is something you were passionate, you felt called to, but the thing that you wanted to do was causing you burnout. And this happens, you said this happens to a lot of people who they're doing the thing they love, they're starting a business, they're whatever. And that's the thing that's killing them. Like, what's going on there?
Well, it seems to be a human condition. Yeah, because that's really surprising. Like from my own perspective as a person of faith, it's like, how could any of this be bad? And I think that kind of got in my way, to be honest with you, because I thought, well, look, the church is growing like crazy. I can't be unhealthy. And of course, I was unhealthy. But it also reminded me of what I saw in law. I mean, I went to law school. I worked in downtown Toronto for a year. I'm Canadian. And I worked in the financial sector. So I saw law at what you might call the top of the game, right? Like Wall Street law kind of thing. And what I noticed there is all these people had dream jobs. My colleagues and the people I was working with for that year had dream jobs, and most of them hated it. Like they had the house, they had I remember one guy had a horse farm in the country, and every day or every week he would buy a lottery ticket, walk it into the firm. Of course, I'm in my mid-20s at that point. He'd wave it in my face and he goes, "Carey, if I ever win this lottery, I'm out of here. You'll never see my face again." And I thought, really? This is like the pinnacle of success, right? Like if you're going to do law, this is near the top of the food chain, and you hate the life you built, like what is that? And then I began to run into that same kind of thing in ministry. And I've seen that in so many people's lives. It's just the stress gets to you and you don't have a formula for how to deal with it. And success can leave you feeling empty on the inside or burned out.
What do you think is the nature of the type of work that causes burnout? It's like I know that pastoral burnout is pretty common.
Yeah.
I can see lawyer burnout. I know that. And then like there's caregiver burnout, like nurses, doctors, people.
Right.
Is it like, is if you're dealing with people, like, is that what causes burnout? Because I look at all those jobs, like you just deal with a lot of people in difficult situations all the time. That makes sense. You would get burnout.
Oh, for sure. In ministry, I mean, it's really hard to say no to people you love, people you care about. We were navigating 30% growth year after year for a number of years. So there was just a run. I've heard, I don't know how true this is, that 15% growth is scalable. Like you can handle that. Anything above that becomes difficult to manage. I was finding it difficult to manage at that point. I don't know. It is endemic to certain careers. For sure, burnout, as I understand the origin of the term, was originally a term to describe the feeling that doctors had in the 1970s. It was like, I feel burned out. I've got compassion fatigue. I've got, too many hours. And the stories you have from the internships of doctors and the residencies are just crazy. And you do know a lot of burned out lawyers. It's easy to get cynical. But what I'm noticing, and I don't know whether you'd agree with this or whether you see this or not, Brett, in your work, but I'm seeing it move from like a work condition to a life condition in the last decade. I meet burned out people everywhere. I meet them in helping professions. I meet them in, other jobs. I meet them online. I meet them, stay-at-home parents feel burned out. I've met retired people who are struggling with overwhelm. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? I think technology maybe had a role in that. And I'm a fan of technology. I'm a podcaster like you are. I run a digital company. But for the first time in history, for the last 15 years, we're having to deal with being on call 24/7 with devices in our pockets that give the world access to us. I don't know that we're built to handle that kind of scale of communication and access. So I see it expanding. And I've also seen some very happy lawyers, some very satisfied pastors. My last 15 years, totally different story than the first 10 years in leadership. But that could definitely be an issue. But I see it as pretty widespread now.
Something you also talk about in the book when you started this burnout, like you didn't recognize you were burnt out right away, but you did notice like, there's a lot of stress and it's crazy town. Things are growing fast. And you would start telling yourself these excuses of, what's going on here. And one of them was like, well, this is just a season. Like, well, we get through this, like we get through this year and things will level off and be better. And you get to the end of the year and it just got crazier. I mean, any other excuses you found yourself telling yourself as you started experiencing this increased level of stress?
Yeah, that was, It could be a whole podcast. I had all kinds of reasons. And I had that. Fortunately, I have good friends and good family, and they would say, what's new with you, Carey? I'm like, well, I'm flying here, flying there. I'm writing this book or whatever. Things are really busy. It's just a busy season. And eventually they started calling me on it. And I realized, like seasons have beginnings and endings. And if your season has no ending, it's not a season, it's your life. So, I got called out on that one. Another lie I think I probably bought into, or an excuse I told myself, is this is the price of success. Like if you want to have something that's growing quickly and you want to accomplish your mission, it's going to cost you personally. I don't believe that anymore, but I fell for that hook, line, and sinker. And yeah, those are a couple of lies I believed. The other thing I really struggled with was I had a sense of time famine. And I lived in this imaginary world where I thought, if I could only have more time, if I could only have more time. And I just don't have enough time to get a proper day off. I just don't have enough time. I think the answer for me was always around the corner, like one more hire or one more season, or if I can just get to Christmas vacation, then I will be better. And of course, that never solves the problem. The problem was internal. The problem was the way that I was approaching leadership and the way that I was stewarding this life I had been given. And once I fixed that, those problems seemed to go away.
Yeah, once you get to Christmas vacation, then Christmas vacation is crazy busy because you got all the holiday stuff you're doing.
And then you're living for spring break.
Yeah,
right?
Then you're living for spring. Then you have to you live for those moments and you have to do a lot of work before you take the break. And then you can kind of enjoy your break. And then when you get back, there's all this work that's built up because you've taken a break. And then you just have to, you work like the Dickens to, catch up on your work. All right. So that's an excuse you got to get out. Like you just got to accept that this is the normal. This is the norm. I've got stuff, things are out of control. I need to get a handle on it. Let's talk about first, like how we get on that pathway towards burnout. And you argue that it's all because we hop on what you call the stress spiral. And there's stages to this. What's the on-ramp? Like what gets us onto this downward stress spiral?
I tried to put my finger, when I was writing the book, I tried to put my finger on the condition that so many people find themselves in, and I named it the stress spiral. And the stress spiral is really three conditions we find ourselves in: overwhelmed, overworked, and overcommitted. And I would say the majority of leaders I interact with these days, and the majority of people I know in my life, would identify with, 2 or 3 out of the 3. I feel overwhelmed. I feel overcommitted. I've said yes to too many things, and I'm overworked. I'm putting in too many hours doing whatever I do. And how do you get there? Well, I think you get into the stress spiral. As I really thought about it, there are 3 primary assets all of us are handling every single day, no matter what your life situation is: time, energy, and priorities. On a vacation, you're dealing with that. How are we going to spend the day? What's the most important thing to do? Do we go out for breakfast? Do we eat in? Do you think we have time for a round of golf today? Or, so-and-so wants us to do X. So it's time, energy. I'm pretty tired today. I don't know whether I can do 18 holes, or at least maybe we better get a cart, right? Or priorities. So even on vacation, you're dealing with that. And at work, that's what you're dealing with. And in life, in normal life, you're dealing with that all the time. And when I began to look back on the period leading into burnout, I noticed that my time was unfocused. I spent it very randomly, usually in a reactive mode to whatever was happening in the moment. My energy levels, I was really unaware of, other than most of the time I felt tired. And then the priorities that I was dealing with, I just let other people hijack my priorities all the time. And so when you have unfocused time, unleveraged energy, and hijacked priorities, you end up feeling overwhelmed, overworked, and overcommitted, and hence you're in the stress spiral.
So this unfocused time, you said you were reactive. Would you just walk into the office, look at your inbox, and let your inbox dictate what you would spend your time on?
Totally. I let everybody, knocks on the door, inboxes, texting was becoming a thing in 2006. And again, rapidly growing organization. Everybody wants to meet with you and you want to meet with everybody. And then of course in ministry and a helping profession, you're dealing with a lot of crises. I was talking to a pastor the other day who said his Saturday got blown up by 2 families that were in crisis. And of course, what I've learned is when your marriage is falling apart, that didn't happen on a Friday night and now you need help on Saturday. Your marriage has been falling apart for years. So perhaps I can't meet you on my day off, but maybe I can meet you next Tuesday at 3:00. But I didn't know that back then. So I just let other people determine how I spent my day. And then the really stressful part of that is like now I run a digital communications company, but back when I was working at a church and leading a church, there was a message due almost, every Sunday. And so I had to show up with something fresh to say, something faithful to say, and something marginally creative so that it engaged people's attention. And again, when you lead a larger church, preaching is an awful lot of the formula for why people come. And so I had that pressure. And when I let other people hijack my mornings, my afternoons, that left like late afternoon for me trying to come up with something I was going to say on the weekend. And of course, then that always bled into the evenings and into days off. So it was just a mess.
And it's going back to this working not in align with your energies. Like sometimes you just work on like these really hard, like writing a sermon, for example, like something that's really creative, requires a lot of thought, a lot of energy. And you'd have to work on that when you weren't feeling that. And sometimes it would end up subpar.
Exactly. Yeah. Like in the stress spiral, unleveraged energy is something I had to think about as I got healthier, because I realized my energy, even on my best days, when I'm fully rested, I'm healthy, I'm feeling good, I'm not burned out, it waxes and wanes over the course of a day. And everybody who's listening to this knows that because you've identified yourself at some point as a night owl or a morning person, or Daniel Pink would argue a lot of people really peak midday, let's say between 10 and 2, or they're afternoon people. But there's a percentage of people who are morning people. Do you have a bias one way or the other? Like, would you say you're a morning person, Brett, or a night owl? Or
I would say morning person, like late morning. That's when I get my best work done.
So your peak hours would be what, after 9?
I'd say after 9. So like between 9 and 11, 9 and 12, I would say would be my best hours.
Okay. You know what you just did? You just confirmed science.
Oh, wow.
And I lived in my 30s as though I had 12 peak hours in a day. And nobody does that. Like maybe a robot does, or your car can run for 12 hours at a certain speed, but human beings can't. And you've just affirmed what I discovered the hard way. You get about 3 to 5 peak hours in a day where your energy is at its best, where you have no brain fog or very little, and you're feeling great, and the ideas flow. If you're a writer, like you produce your best content in that time. If you're working on strategy, your thinking is clear, you're able to map out the future. If you're working on spreadsheets, you just haven't got that many errors, right? Or maybe you came up with a really creative pivot table that you haven't thought of before. That's about 3 to 5 hours where your energy is at its peak. And then all of us end up with an hour or two in a typical day where we're kind of dragging. For me, that's between 4 and 6 in the afternoon. Do you have an hour or two where you're like, I either need a nap or I need to go for a run or something?
Yeah, like 3, and between 3 and 5. And that's when I usually do my workout. It's like 4:30.
Very typical. Yeah. And a really good use of your workout zone. I know that's important to you, but are you training for the Olympics? Probably not.
No.
No. So you don't need to take your prime time to do your workouts. A lot of morning people still work out in the morning. And if that really helps you be more productive, awesome. But I've moved my exercise to the late afternoon because otherwise I either want to have a nap or I want to get moving my body so that I sort of get re-energized for the evening. So what I discovered with that time is I was spending it really unstrategically, wasting my best hours of the day where I could produce the best content that I was capable of producing, and often putting it off till the late afternoon when I was already tired, over caffeinated, and when I didn't feel like doing it anymore. And it just created this stress spiral that led me further and further and eventually into burnout.
And I want to talk more about how we can leverage our energy. And part of that is getting on what you call the thrive cycle, which is the opposite of the stress cycle. And the first step of getting on the thrive cycle is focusing your time instead of having unfocused time. And you argue, the first step in focusing your time is you have to make 2 critical mental shifts about time if you want to do a better job managing your time. So what are those 2 mental shifts? Well,
the first mental shift I made was I had to get past my excuses, which we've hinted at already. And my excuse was, I don't have the time for that. And I read this little book. I don't think it's even in print anymore, and I don't remember where I got it or even what the title is, but it was about what is your life like if you're the president of the United States? I think it was written for 8th graders. I don't know how I ended up reading it. It was probably a bad season of my life, but it was really fascinating. And I remember having this aha moment where I thought, the president of the United States gets as many hours in the day as any other human being. And he, or maybe in the future she, has to, at that point, govern the free world with that same 24 hours in a day that I get. And it made me think about all the really successful leaders I admire and the very best. They make you feel they're never in a rush. They have all the time in the world for you. They really pay attention to you. And they might be running 20 companies, but you'd never know it. They're not frantic. And I started calling myself out on my speech and auditing my speech. And I made myself stop saying things like, I don't have the time to do that. Because I realized I did. Like all through my 30s, people said, Carey, you got to write a book. You got to write a book. And I would always say, I don't have the time for that. I don't have the time for that. Well, since I burned out, I've written 5 books over the last decade. And I had the time for it. I just wasn't taking it. I also got rid of my excuse language when it came to, sorry, I couldn't get that done. Well, actually, I could have gotten it done. I chose not to. And when I got honest with myself, it really made me come to terms with how I was squandering time. And then the second shift I made when it comes to time management, and these are like easy to recognize and to understand, very difficult to do. But I would say, just to wrap up the first one before we dive fully into the second one, is stop saying you don't have the time. Start admitting to yourself you didn't make it. Now that's really hard, but if you're consistently for a month not making the time to work out, that tells you something about your priorities. Or if your mom's been saying, hey, when are you going to call me? And for a month you haven't called your mom because you're telling yourself, I don't have the time, I don't have the time, I don't have the time. Well, really? You haven't had like 20 minutes to call your mom in the last month? Like, it makes you get really honest with yourself. And then the second mental shift was to decide to abandon balance and embrace passion. I had thought about balance as a life goal for a long time and probably put it on my New Year's resolutions on different years. And then I began to look at balanced people. Very few people claim to have achieved balance. But when I saw it, it started to bother me because in the lives of the people I knew who would say, hey, I'm really balanced, it seems like their balance was a retreat. They kept stepping back. I'm doing less work. I'm doing less of this. I'm doing less of that. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know what? Like, I don't want to do less with my life. I want to make a difference. And so I decided to abandon balance and embrace passion. That whatever I allow on my calendar, whatever I allow, if I'm going to preach on the weekend, I'm going to do a killer job. If I'm going to do this interview, I'm going to walk in prepared. If I'm going to have a date night with my wife, and we've been married for decades, I'm going to show up fully present. If I'm spending a day with my sons who are now grown, I'm going to be there, not like half on my phone. So I just decided whatever I allow in my life, which is a minority of the opportunities that I have, I'm just going to be fully present and I'm going to do it passionately. And that has made a huge difference. And by the way, that also applies to time off. If I'm going to vacation, I'm going to vacation. If I'm going to sleep for 8 hours, I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm going to sleep passionately. I'm going to get a great night's sleep so I can hit the ground running the next day. So those were 2 really helpful ways to think about time and how to approach time. I've got the time. If I didn't do it, I just didn't make it. And then whatever I allow myself to do, I'm going to do passionately.
And I imagine what that did is it made you pickier about the things you committed to.
Way pickier. And, it got me to the point where I thought, I'm just not going to say yes. And this is still hard. Like if you're looking at an active thing I have to work on daily, like you, I get far more opportunities than I have time available to do them. Just this morning, I got a text from a friend. Hey, you want to be on my podcast? I asked my staff. They said, well, you're booking 3 months in advance. So I had to let them know, no, I can't do it. And old me would have found a crack in the calendar and would have said, yeah, I can do that with you. And my assistant said, but Carey, you need to write a really good article for next week. You got a book launch coming up and you got this coming up and you got that coming up. You really can't do it. So yeah, that allows me to be fully present for this interview as well.
Well, so this, focusing your time is very connected to hijacking or preventing hijack of your priorities. So this is an example. You have these filters in place that you've put in place for yourself where it makes it harder for other people to hijack your priorities. Any other tips that you found that are useful to prevent that from happening?
One hijack priority person is you. You are a good hijacker of your own priorities. I know I am, because I can be completely undistracted. So let's say I recognize I've got those peak energy times, which mine are about 7 to 11 a.m., and I'm going to work on a really big article for a major publication. I am fully capable of distracting myself. I may have put the world at bay and said, you guys stay away, and they stay away. And next thing you know, I'm 5 videos into a YouTube wormhole that I can't get out of, or I get bored. We're getting addicted to being constantly connected to other people. So I think you can hijack your own priorities. So I encourage, and this is not new advice, but I encourage everyone, turn off all notifications on all of your devices. And a shocking number of people have never done that. And you can program a few people to ring through. I have some favorites on my iPhone that can get to me anytime, but they're the kinds of people that tend not to interrupt me on a constant basis, or they wouldn't be a favorite. So, if you're worried about your daughter, well, your daughter can phone through. That's fine. But if she's interrupting you 5 times a day, you can have a conversation with her about that. So you have to watch your own distractions. Another one definitely is people. People can be a huge distraction. And there's a principle, I think, for how you manage your time, which I hope helps a lot of people. And it's simply that the wrong people will always ask for your time and the right people never will. Maybe your spouse, if you're married, or your partner wishes that they could spend more time with you, or your kids wish they could spend more time with you, or you haven't talked to your best friend in a little while. They're rarely going to be as persistent as some of the chronic underperformers at work, or the people whose lives are constantly in crisis. So again, being in ministry, we had crises almost every day. And what I learned over time, and this is hard, but people who are in the helping profession will probably realize this. There are some people who actually do not want to get well, and they will suck your time. So sometimes it's the people who always have a new crisis in their life. It's like, well, last week it was this, but this week it's this. And they want to see you, and they want to see you this morning, and they want to see you on their schedule. And I had to learn that probably that is not the best use of their time and not the best use of my time. Psychologist John Townsend says people like that sometimes have a flat learning curve. They just want your time, but they don't want to get better. Another thing you'll do as a boss, and I've been a boss for over 2 decades, is you'll say, well, I got to spend time with my low performers, the staff member who's always late, or somebody who just can never hit their targets, right? You're really not doing very well at this job, so I got to meet with you again. And you owe that to everyone once or twice. But the reality is there's probably some people in your life that you've been meeting with now for months about being late, and they're still late, or the people who never hit their quotas. And you got to ask yourself, is that the best use of your time? Because number one, those meetings are draining. Number two, you're not helped by it. And number three, neither are they. And if they're looking for a way to improve their lives, you're probably not the coach that's going to help them do it. So what I've had to do over the last 15 years is make sure, I'll meet any team member anybody wants. But if my coaching isn't making them better, why do I keep coming back to that week after week after week? When I cleared all of that off of my calendar, first of all, I had way fewer meetings. Secondly, I then started to call up some of the best people in my life, like the top performers. Who is your best salesperson? Who is your best vice president? Who is your best associate pastor? Who is your best whatever? And meet with them, because they're not asking for your time. And they're doing a great job doing what they're doing. But what I've learned is those meetings are almost always energizing. Number two, everybody gets better. So your mission actually gets accomplished. And number three, they really appreciate it and will lean in even harder. And you should do the same with the most important people in your life, with your family, with your best friends, with the people who are really producing well. It creates kind of a virtuous loop, a virtuous cycle.
How do you handle, so let's talk about those people who come to you for help, like they're just struggling and you keep meeting with them and nothing seems to get better. How do you tell them I can't do this anymore, in a way that's, I guess, compassionate is the right word? Because obviously they're struggling and they're hurting and they need something. So how do you say, this isn't the best thing for either of us. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's hard. It never gets easy. But what I would typically do, it's not that different from your question, is to sit down with them and say, I really appreciated meeting with you. Clearly, you've got a lot going on. I am not sure that I'm the person who's going to be able to help you with that. So I did go to seminary as well as